Yes, we can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to talk about, obviously, the topic is the technological revolution, the scientific revolution, and I gave you a brief sort of background into how the scientific revolution that we know of today, what we studied in our books, that's the European scientific revolution, but it wasn't the scientific revolution. It certainly wasn't the first scientific revolution. I want to talk about the scientific revolution that led to that scientific revolution, and it is the Islamic scientific revolution. We're going to go into why it should be called the first one. I'm going to give you all the reasons, but the most important thing that has to be emphasized, and it has to be emphasized again and again, is that the Quran, it was the Quran that literally changed the world. The world before the revelation of the Quran and the world after the revelation of the Quran are complete different realities. They're not the same worlds. And we're going to see how the Quran influenced these different areas. So I'm going to be choosing just 4 sectors that actually define what an advanced civilization looks like. So you have science and technology, you have healthcare, education, and economy. So we're going to see how the Quran changed the world in these 4 sectors. Now, what we're going to be talking is how it influenced the first international. It was the first international scientific revolution, because before that, if you see, the intellectual revolutions of the Greco-Roman period or the Indian civilization or the Chinese civilization, they were just limited to their geographical areas. But now we're going to see something, this very new phenomenon of an international scientific revolution. So great innovations in healthcare, education, the proliferation of education. We're going to see something that has never happened before, where every member of the society is obligated to at least get basic education. And greatly it influenced the medieval era economy. We're going to see that. But before we understand how, because the claim that I'm putting forward, for most of you, it may be a new one, maybe you're not well aware of that, but this is how the things happened. You had the revelation of the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ. What the revelation of the Quran led to was the construction of a worldview. You had a worldview being constructed. That worldview created a culture. The Islamic, the first Islam culture, you could call it the Medinan culture or the first Islamic culture, the early society, and all of that then slowly and steadily influenced the creation of a social structure, technology, industry, science, education, infrastructure, politics, and all of that. So it was the Quran at the base, at the root, that was shaping all of that. So how do we say that? Let's go into that. So I'm going to define what a scientific revolution is. It's a sudden cultural shift from earlier practices, earlier methods in understanding the world, the natural world that we call, the physical world that we call. And when you have like a complete shift in your ways of understanding, the methods that you're using, that is what a revolution is. That's what a scientific revolution is. So here, it can be called the essential characteristics of the Islamic golden age were that it was, like I said, the first truly international intellectual revolution. Now, scholars from different cultural backgrounds participated in it. This is very important to understand, that it wasn't just science, it wasn't just religion. It was an actual merging of these great sectors of learning, or these great areas of knowledge together. So firstly, you have the development of the religious sciences that's taking place in the 1st century, that's taking place from the Prophet ﷺ in Medina and later on in the 1st century. That's fiqh, usul, and it goes on till the first 3 centuries, first 4 centuries. But then along with that, it also brings in the spiritual sciences. You have tasawwuf, you have al-ihsan, which is the heart of Islam. How do you know Allah? How do you worship Allah as if you see him? That's the core of tasawwuf. That's the core of al-ihsan. And that's coming out from the Medinan society to the later generations. And I heard a very beautiful talk yesterday. I think it was Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in one of their sessions. He said a beautiful thing. He said, there used to be people in our tradition called the muhaqqiqun. Muhaqqiqun are people who verified the tradition, verified Islam, in the sense they went through Islam, through all of the pillars of Islam, through all of the stages of Iman, and then to Ihsan, and they verified, what? This is the truth. If you go through all of these stages, you're gonna realize that this is the truth. So there's this sense of objectivity in our religion. And then he compared it with what this very famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said about that science is something which is falsifiable. Anything which is not falsifiable, it should not be called science. So we have this falsifiability in our religion that anybody can just go through the procedure and you're going to see that this is the truth. And generations after generations have gone through this. You can only go through that when you follow the religious sciences followed by the spiritual sciences. But that wasn't it. You had the rational sciences then coming up. So you had questions like, because Islam was interacting with the Christian world, with the Greek world, the vestiges of the Greek civilization, the Hindu world, there were questions on who is God? What are the attributes of God? So all of these had to be covered with rationality. So there was the introduction of the rational sciences. You had philosophy being imported from these ancient civilizations, but then it being used to understand the bigger questions about reality. What's the universe? What is it constructed of? How does God interact with the universe? How does God, the one, create the world of the many? So all of this comes under philosophy. Then you had the analytic theology, which is our Kalam tradition. So you had, like, Imam al-Ghazali is from the Kalam tradition, right? And logic. And then along with all of these sciences, you have the development of the physical sciences taking place. So it's in the same intellectual milieu that you have physics, biology, chemistry being developed when all of these religious sciences are being developed. So why should it be called the first scientific revolution? Because the reasons are very simple. The basic principles of science were formally codified. You can check what were the principles of science before Islam and what were the principles of science during the Islamic period. And you can see they're actually using the science that we use now. But you cannot find those same principles and methods in earlier civilizations, even though earlier civilizations also had science. But then the principles are codified by the Muslims. So it was a big leap. It was a paradigm shift from this theory-driven approach, this philosophy about nature, to the science about nature. So that requires inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a very core part of scientific reasoning that you see. Let's say you see, 1,000 white swans, and then you can deduce from that, you can actually, conclude from that swans are usually white. So that is used throughout scientific reasoning. And then the emphasis on observation and experimentation, this was extremely important, and this we see in the Muslim world. We don't see it so much in earlier civilizations, that the Muslims were insistent that the way the universe is constructed, this will yield, repeated experimentation will yield the truth. So they believed in a particular type of a philosophical idea, which is called realism, scientific realism, that the universe, if you conduct experiments again and again, you are actually going to come more and more closer to the truth. And then it was international in character as well. You see the Persians, the Arabs, the Northern Arabs, and then stretching to China, the Caucasus, all joining in. Now, what we have here is, now, again, the same questions I've asked here, that it's a different world before Islam and it's a different world after Islam. And this is where we understand that what was happening in the Muslim world was extraordinary. It cannot be overlooked. It is an important link to understand our world today. So, ways in which the Quran influenced. Now, this is the important question, and this is the most important thing to understand, because we're going to be using this to talk about how can we now, replicate this? How can we now move towards a second golden age when we understand what's the Quran? Because you see, we don't have the Islamic scientific revolution. We don't have the golden age. We don't have those people. We hardly have a few manuscripts, and then we have some knowledge on that. So essentially, how can we replicate something which is so, and the world has changed so much. How do you replicate that, which has, which is far in the past? The only way we can do that is because we have something which they had, and which is the Quran. And now we're going to see how the Quran influenced their greatness. So it provided the initial impetus. We're going to see that. The Tawheedic philosophy of science, the philosophy of science that was used was Tawheed. I mean, we think of Tawheed as something we read, La ilaha illallah, we do our zikr and stuff, but we would never think, how can the philosophy of science be, utilize something as religious as Tawheed? And then the practical needs of the Ummah needed science. The Ummah needed science to improve its religious experience. And so we go to how the Quran demands producing this demonstrable proof. This idea of a scientific mindset was created in the Medinan society, wherein this idea of always validating the truth was present. So whether you're saying whether this truth belongs to any domain, the religious sciences or the rational sciences or the spiritual sciences, how do you validate it? So Muslims were always obsessed with this idea of finding the Burhan. And you see this word Burhan, if most of us have read the Quran, and the other name of the Quran is Burhan. And this word Burhan means demonstrable proof. We can see this mentioned in the scientific text as well as the philosophical text. That tells you how central the Quran was to their education, to their understanding. Then, like I said, questions of free will. It was, history, time itself forced Muslims to develop science. And the inductive method that I just described right now, it was first used, which is very interesting. The first use of this inductive method was in the codification of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. So the fuqaha used this scientific method, and which is so amazing that our religious sciences are as rigorous and as objective as our physical sciences, and even spiritual sciences for that matter. It's a lovely quote from Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. He says that consider the things which relate our past to our future. One such link is the inductive method. He talks about this, the inductive method, which has been applied to modern sciences now. It's a blessing bestowed to the world by the Holy Quran. So he's one of the few people in the modern era who recognize that there you have it, the inductive kind of reasoning where you go from the unknown to the known. You make a conclusion about these are the known facts, and now I can infer the unknown from there. This is actually from the Quran, because that's how we come to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says the results and fruits of the inductive method are quite apparent today. That's the scientific revolution, right? So all branches of knowledge evolved now in the same intellectual milieu that I was talking about. Muzaffar Iqbal, he says that the religious sciences provided the intellectual context and some elements of the methodology that was later used by natural sciences. Again, echoing the same idea that you had first the religious sciences being built and the same methodology being used to develop the physical sciences. And which is very interesting. You know why I'm mentioning all of this? Primarily is because all of us right now here, we know that science is presented as a challenge to the religious way of life. The biggest and the most notorious of atheists are scientists. And they say, we don't need religion, we have science, and science can be proved, religion can't be proved, and all of that, But when we go to the Islamic world, we actually see that not only are the people who are developing the science scholars, religious scholars, fuqaha, ulama, but they're actually using the same methods that they used for their religious sciences in building physical sciences, That's fascinating. What that tells us, and inshallah we can be speaking about that before, is that that means we can replicate that. That means a sophisticated or a scientifically, inundated society like ours can also be a very religious and spiritual society. We can see that from our past. So the same adherence to truth and objectivity, a respect for the corroborated empirical evidence, an eye for detail, refined taste for proper categorization and classification of data. They use the same methods for fiqh, for hadith sciences, for usul, and then for physics, biology, chemistry, and all of that. The Quran created this worldview. This worldview created the sciences, and all of this together led to a culture, which was an advanced culture, a scientific culture. And you could say the religious sciences led to the rational sciences, philosophy, kalam, logic, etc. And then the physical sciences came out as a result of that. All of this was under the Quranic worldview. These people, they didn't find being a scientist or developing biology in, conflict with their religious understanding of the world. Because why? We're going to go into that. Because they used Tawheed as their underlying principle, their philosophy of science. You see, science cannot function without a philosophy. Actually, anything cannot function without a philosophy. You have to have like a base framework to do anything. And that base framework of science, of anything actually, is the philosophy. So what are your presuppositions? What are your methods? What are you aiming at? What are the ethics? All of this is philosophy. So the early Muslims are using Tawheed, which is something very religious for us. They're using the same thing as the philosophy of science. How are they doing that? If that's the question you may ask, like, La ilaha illallah, how can that become a philosophy? And right now, we hear so many people who have this very strong misconception that philosophy has nothing to do with Islam and philosophy is bid'ah and all of that. But you don't find that in the earlier generations. They actually, like I'm saying, Tawheed is actually being used as a philosophy of science. How are they doing that? Now, you need a philosophy of nature to develop science. You need to have presuppositions. What they do is, what they understood is that even if we're going to understand that rain is caused by the water cycle, but at the end of the day, the ultimate causal power, the one who's driving all of this, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who controls the entire universe. Modern science, on the other hand, what do we have? Attributes all physical phenomena to blind forces. Nature is understood as this blind force that does things superbly, but without any purpose and without any controller. So that's shirk. We're going to go into that. Dr. Usman Bakr, he says, in Islam, religious consciousness of Tawheed is the source of the scientific spirit in all domains of knowledge. Consequently, Islamic intellectual tradition does not entertain the idea of natural sciences alone as being scientific or as being more scientific than the other sciences. We saw the same method being used in fiqh, in usul, in tasawwuf. And then you had the first few people, actually, Jabir bin Hayyan, you have Ibn al-Haytham. All of these, what are they doing? Even if we go and zoom in on their methodologies, they're actually using this Tawheedic philosophy of science. They emphasize on the need for experimentation, for scientific accuracy. Then Ibn al-Haytham, who's the founder of the scientific method, because his writings are what influenced father of modern science. So what was Ibn al-Haytham doing? His works were all about, he writes very beautifully in his works, in his Kitab al-Manazir. He uses Islamic theological concepts like Sunnatullah, al-Hatmiyat, al-Ilmiyat. These are kalam, words, terminology that's used in the kalam tradition. And he uses them to frame the scientific method. So now, like I did cover this is in sharp contrast with the Greek approach. We talked about, okay, another way of why science was developed in the Muslim world. It was We saw how the Quran was the initial impetus, how the Tawheed became the philosophy of science, but actually the actual driving force of the creation of science were the practical needs of the Ummah. How do you calculate the time for Asr? Asr is very tricky if you're away from the equator. You need maths, you need trigonometry for that. So they developed astronomy and mathematical geography just to understand how to calculate Asr. And again, the Qibla, the timings plus the Qibla. This led to the development of new trigonometric laws. You had cosine law. Now, the Indians were very good with sine, but the Muslims developed the cosine. And even the invention of a new field of spherical trigonometry, which I love, discussing this, because we have people, some Muslims who believe that the earth is flat, but then you had like people developing spherical trigonometry that already incorporates the spherical model of the earth in just to calculate the Qibla. So that means when we bow down 5 times a day, you actually admit that the earth is spherical because you're using spherical trigonometry for that. And other things, navigation and travel, you need to understand how big the earth is, what's the circumference of the earth. Christopher Columbus, for his very famous journey, transatlantic journey, he used the coordinates of the Muslim geographer Al-Farghani. It's said actually that he was presented with the Roman work on this, on geography, mathematical geography, but he actually preferred Al-Farghani. That's the kind of respect, that's the kind of status Muslim scientists had. Then, zakat. As you can see, these are all like the 5 pillars of Islam are actually inspiring the development of science. How do you calculate zakat where you have different kinds of wealth? You have cattle, you have gold, you have property. So they developed algebra for that, Al-Khwarizmi. And he actually writes it in his introduction that this discipline that he's using should be used to facilitate religious transactions. He was doing it in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, dietary regulations. In Islam, we can't just eat anything, the things that are forbidden. This led Muslim scientists to understand why is, let's say, the pig forbidden to be eaten? What are the properties of particular animals and what are their traits, anatomy, adaptation? So you have biological theories and even some evolutionary ideas that have been discussed in the sense, the habitat, the adaptation and different ideas, the food chain, the dependency, all of that. All grounded in Islam and the Quran, which I find so interesting. I'm actually writing a paper on this, that you had rigorous biological sciences in the Muslim world. Never once did they, lead to the atheistic drive that it did in Europe. Now, time is very important because of the salawat. Again, we're still on the 5 pillars. And how do you, keep your time? How do you understand what the time is for prayer? This led to the development of sophisticated mechanical clocks and even to robotics. Now, did you know that Muslims invented robotics, which is so cool? I mean, you have to see one of the robots that one of the scientists, Al-Jazari, created. It's literally like exactly like the way robotics, the kind of robots that we have, but it's just that it's run on hydraulics, that is, fluid dynamics, or it's run on wind. So hydraulics technology, automated programmable machines that ran on water and air. Again, free and fair economic practices encouraged, mentioned in the Quran, led to minting of gold. Now, you're minting gold, you need to have an expertise in metallurgy, chemistry. So Muslims invented chemistry. It's actually written that before Muslims, there was this pseudo-scientific discipline of alchemy. It was Muslims who made it a scientific discipline of chemistry. Hygiene. So how do you deal with, an injunction like that? They invented hard soaps made out of different oils, alkalis. Alkali is an Arabic word, it's al-qali, and popularized even alcohol for that matter. And alcohol was used for its medical, hygiene purposes, basically its antiseptic properties. And the miswak, the shampoo, all of these later on actually become a kind of industry in its own. In Syria, you had like tiny factories making this. So this is like the first few, signs of the Muslim industrial revolution. Now, you had Jabir bin Hayyan. Now we're talking about now serious technology coming up. So Jabir bin Hayyan, it actually belongs to the earlier period, but he was way ahead of his time. He actually puts forward the roadmap for the extent of scientific progress. And he even anticipated the creation of artificial intelligent life in a lab environment in the future. I mean, he talks about this concept of taqween, and taqween is creation from the word kaun. He talks about this. This is how far science can go, that we can reach a place where we can create life in a laboratory atmosphere. So we talked about steam engines. We all understand, okay, the steam engine, Europe, the British colonial period, but actually no, the steam engine was actually created in the Muslim world. Even very important parts of your automobiles, the camshaft, the crankshaft, all of these were invented by Muslims. Al-Jazari, the scientist, the inventor of robotics. And Tipu Sultan, who was an Indian prince we know from Mysore, he is the one who invented the, rocket propulsion, the rocket technology, fuel, based rockets in the 1700s, and he used it against the British. And it is very important. Even issues of defense led to various inventions. You actually have the first, most of you would know, okay, the telescope was built by, was actually built by Galileo, or the one before that, the Dutch guy, I forgot his name. And that's what we've read, but actually when you read Islamic history, and especially in the Arabic works that are still to be translated, there's a mention of an optical device wherein you can see the moon and the closest stars, the planets that is. And that was being used by Harun al-Rashid for defense purposes. I love this quote. Dr. Fathur Rahman Ansari, who was a great scholar from Pakistan, from Karachi, he said, the Prophet ﷺ has two roles, being the landmark in human history. He came to close one era of human history, the era of prophetic revelation, but he also inaugurated the modern scientific era. This you can find when you read the Quran, the Hadith, Muslim history, or the history of modern science. So the Prophet ﷺ here ends one era, which is the pre-scientific era. He inaugurates another era, which is the modern scientific era. Now, let's go into a bit on healthcare. Again, same thing. You see Bimaristan, the first hospitals being built in the Muslim world. And it was all from the very first years. The Prophet ﷺ commissioned the mobile hospital to be set up in the Battle of Khandak. And the one who used to manage that was a woman, Rufaida al-Aslamiyya, and that it became like the inspiration for hospitals throughout the Muslim world. So, and these were not like regular healthcare centers. You had like modern facilities of pharmacy, library. These became teaching institutions as well. You needed a license to practice. These were big budget projects, actually. If you see many of these, the one in Cairo, it's still standing. It's a beautiful building. And annual budgets were as high as 10,000 dinars. That's a huge amount, even from the standards of today. And despite all of this, now here's what we're going to concentrate on again and again. This is the difference. We're not just talking about science. We're talking about ethical science. We're talking about revolutionary science. Despite the fact that these were really expensive institutions, the treatment was free for anyone and everyone, regardless of your gender, regardless of your religion even. So here, a very important historian, he says that we have reason to believe that when during the Crusades, Europe at last began to establish hospitals, they were inspired by the Arabs of the Near East. The first hospital in Paris was founded by Louis IX after his return from the Crusades. So the Europeans came to fight the Muslims, but they actually took back technology, culture, and all that. The same can be said for economy. You see the same thing, trade. You know, this whole body of legislation that was developed covering contracts. How do you make contracts? How do you make exchanges, loans? And you had the building of the first free and fair trade, which you could say, is it capitalistic? Because capitalism, calls for free and fair trade, but it wasn't capitalistic because it was not monopolistic. You had innovations like checks. That was actually an Islamic innovation, to write a check. Usury-less money lending system. So the first banking system, but without the interest. And also commercial methods of writing, recording, joint stock companies and all of that. Ibn Khaldun is by far, he's the most well-known of all the scientists in the West, because he is understood to be the first, sociologist and historiographer in the West as well. And the first person to write a very well-developed economic and social theory. So caravanserais, we've all seen that in Ertugrul. Those were really, important institutions, charitable foundations. They provided travelers with 3 days of free shelter and food. Again and again, if you can see, this is advanced, it's scientific, it's modern as we would understand modern to be, but it's ethical and it's humane. And this is something that we need to revive again. Lastly, let's talk about a little bit about education, the democratization of education, which you find nowhere before Islam, that previous civilizations, education was only reserved for the elite and the affluent. So if you read the the Indian education system, only the monks, only the Brahmin caste from the Orthodox schools, or from the heterodox schools, only the monks of the Buddhists were required to get this education. But the Prophet ﷺ made education compulsory for everyone. And the masjid, the religious center, was the school, the educational center. And you had, which is so amazing, that you had people being taught religious knowledge along with astronomy, logic, mathematics, anatomy. Dr. Adil talked about the university in Qayrawiyyin, which was set up by Fatima al-Fihri. There, all of these subjects were taught, and which is something we can't even imagine in today's life. Going to a masjid and people being taught astronomy. That's just amazing. And that's what we've lost, and that's what we need to revive again. So the first ever research institute, as we know in history, was Darul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And we know about Fatima al-Fihri. This whole idea of Fatima al-Fihri is so controversial now, because you have this idea that has been constructed of the Muslim woman being oppressed and, like a second-class citizen. And you have Muslims contributing to that narrative as well, the extremist Muslims, and you have others, the non-Muslim Islamophobes adding to that narrative. But Fatima al-Fihri comes across as like somebody who negates all of this. But because it's so too much to take, it's too much to swallow, and it's too unpalatable for such sensibilities. There's some research, even though it's a fringe group, there's some research that don't accept this narrative, and they're like, Fatima al-Fihri didn't exist. I mean, this whole story is too good to be true. And then they go into historical research and they say, okay, we don't have primary sources, we have some secondary sources talking about her, and which is not good enough for us, so we're going to reject that story. But actually that's a result of a particular approach to history. That approach to history is called a post-structuralism or critical theory and revisionism. So they don't accept they don't accept anything other than primary sources. But if you take that as your standard to understand history, you'll actually have to deny much of Greek history, much of Islamic history. You'll this is the same approach that some people take to deny even the existence of Isa alayhi salam. So I'm actually shocked many Muslims buy into this post-structuralist, revisionist approach to history, and they don't understand, if you take that approach, you'll actually have to deny that Isa alayhi salam existed, or that Mecca was an important hub, because they're using this approach. So it's a very Western and it has its serious problems. But the first university, as we talked about, in Europe was established by Muslims. This is very important, in the city of Salerno in Italy. And we see the vestiges, the signs of the Islamic culture in higher education even today, with the gown that they wear, the hat, the flat hat that we wear when we graduate. These are all from the Islamic tradition. This is all recorded in history. Oh, by the way, the flat hat, which is called the mortar board, that graduates used to wear, that actually used to be in the Muslim world, that used to symbolize the Quran. So the graduate, the one who got the ijazah, would place the Quran on their head, and basically that would mark their beginning. Now, they have understood the book of Allah, or they are licensed to teach the book of Allah. And then women's education, that's the most important. Under Western rule, like, women were actually allowed to enter universities, not to even teach, enter universities as early, I mean, as far, literally recent as the 19th century. And you have women, I'm going to go into that, inshallah, teaching, establishing institutions way back in the 9th century. So I'll just summarize. Early Muslims, they were inspired by the Quran. They created the greatest intellectual revolution in history. The Quran was integral to all Muslim discourse, be it religious, scientific, philosophical, political, economic. That's what we need to recreate. That's what we're talking about. And it's just a mindset, and then it's action. The greatest difference between the contemporary Muslim world and the early Muslims is that we've limited the Quran to just a spiritual guide. That's it. The Quran is just a spiritual book. And intellectual revival in the Muslim Ummah necessitates that the Quran should be made central to all aspects of life for the Muslim world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister